morning we've talked about Lauren Dickinson. There's still a lot more to go on that one, obviously, with Justice Manda. I think most New Zealanders feel that the right verdict was reached yesterday and had enough evidence being presented at the trial to make that assessment. We've also talked this morning about the fall in dairy prices, of course, and the effect that that's going to have and how they are worked out. And obviously that's going to have some impact also, Air Waka and Noah. What's going to happen in terms of global agricultural emissions and whether or not that will be resurrected in 8 weeks' time, should there be a change in government, and if it isn't, what's going to happen there anyhow. But also yesterday, and lost amidst that sort of drama, obviously, particularly around the Dickinson verdict yesterday, was a decision by the Reserve Bank Governor, Adrian Orr, to keep the official cash rate pretty much as it is, which, depending on which way you look at it, is either a good piece of news or a bad piece of news. The person to give us some indication on that anyhow, and what's been happening in the economic and financial space over the last week is one of New Zealand's leading business persons, certainly one of New Zealand's leading business commentators, Craig Stobo, and he joins us now. Craig, welcome to the show this afternoon.
Hello.
What have you been up to the last
Mike.
week?
I was down your hood, experiencing some of your fine weather and powdered ski slopes, which was fantastic. So had a pleasant 4 days there and then back on the tools in Auckland. So regretfully, would like to stay down there with the snow that's fallen, and wishing all the ski businesses that are associated with the ski industry, all the very best to make up the lost time after the last 3 or 4 years of really tough conditions for them.
You're a skier.
Yes, I am.
You used to be a mountain climber too, didn't you?
Yes, I was.
Do you still do that?
Risk profile's changed somewhat. Yeah. I climbed in New Zealand, Peruvian Andes, the Nepalese Himalaya, and the Pakistani Karakoram. So yes, the big ones. So that was a while ago, though, Michael. So they're smaller ambitions now.
You would have a view then on the latest issue, just before we go on to what we're going to talk about, the female Norwegian who made the circuit of, was it K2, and walked past the apparently dying Pakistani porter. What was your sort of reaction to that?
I'd like to hear both sides of the story. So at those altitudes, and K2 was one of the 14 8,000 metre peaks in the world, and arguably one of the more difficult to climb, and not just get up but get back. So at the top you're only halfway. The circumstances at altitude, when there are very small degrees of freedom and windows to get up and down and survive yourself, make it difficult. I'm not saying that you don't help people, of course you do, but I'd like to hear both sides of the story and actually what went on. Observing someone going past at a point in time when you don't know what happened before and the condition of that person, it's very difficult to make a judgment. And listeners probably recall Rob Hall's own experience, which was assisting a client when perhaps, in retrospect, he shouldn't have encouraged or allowed the client to achieve the ascent because it put at risk both parties. So, and ultimately cost Rob his life. So you've got to be very careful. It's very different in thin air at 7,500 metres to sitting at sea level in New Zealand. So I just suspend judgment till we hear a bit more about it.
You've climbed at that levels though. What's it like, Craig? I will never do it, and 99.9% of us won't either. Everybody says it's very difficult. All we see is, why can't you just walk up there? You've got oxygen. Is there a problem if you've got oxygen, or is it a lot of people don't use oxygen anyhow?
For the 8,000 metre peak in Pakistan, we didn't have oxygen. Some people are susceptible to pulmonary edema, which is water on the lungs at altitude. And when I was climbing in the Peruvian Andes, one of our members suffered from that, partly brought on by kidney stones, and we had to nurse him down and take him back out. So it does depend on individuals, how they react at altitude, but a lot of it is around acclimatisation, moving to those areas slowly, taking steps and stages, one at a time, before you make the final push to get up and back again in the right sort of weather window. And then there are snow conditions, the objective dangers, how you react with your fellow climbers in different conditions. The good thing is the mountains don't go away, so if you are constrained in any way and think about risk appropriately, you can always back off, go back down and come back another day. And some people feel pressured by the time that they have and they make poor decisions. And at that altitude, there's not a lot of discretion for bad decisions.
And I guess actually just trying to get somebody down again would be difficult too if they're dead, wouldn't it?
Yeah, well, in the Peruvian case, we made a stretcher out of our ropes and kind of carried them down to lower altitudes to a local farmer and then a donkey driver in our area, and he got moved back out to Lima and then back to New Zealand to recuperate. So, yeah, it's not easy, but in the Pakistani example, we were unfortunately involved with a tragedy with our fellow Pakistani Army climbing team who achieved or were trying to achieve the same goal as us on Gashbrum 2 and chose a different route to me, but one that my fellow climbers also chose, but decided to back off and come down. Those Pakistani Army climbers decided to camp out. One of their members was sick with pulmonary edema. They decided to come down, but after the 7 o'clock in the morning scheduled call, we heard no more, but our team at the glacier level below the mountain recorded an avalanche, and all 4 members of the Pakistani Army climbing team were swept to their deaths, and we were able to assist in the recovery of their bodies with Pakistani Army helicopters going to 20,000 feet, which in itself was amazing. But that destroys, of course, the morale of teams, and so we ended up trekking out back down the Baltoro Glacier to Rawalpindi and Islamabad and then home again. But we were asked by the families of those that died, wives, sisters, uncles, brothers, just to recall their last moments. So, as I said, the risks are elevated, and you just got to make good decisions. So it can be a dangerous environment, but the danger isn't the mountain. The danger is you yourself putting yourself in those positions. So it's not the mountains per se, it's yourself and the context that you put yourself in.
Craig, what a fascinating life you've had. I knew you at university, obviously, and I met you a wee while after university as well when we lived in Wellington. But, gee, you're worth a book, mate.
It'd be a very small one, I think, Michael. I don't think it warrants a book.
I think not. No. If you're not going to write it, for God's sake, get somebody else to, because you've just had such a varied career. No. You're an amazing man, Craig. I always remember you as being, just to explain to everybody else, Craig's, what are you, about 6'1", 6'2"?
That's the old imperial system, Michael. Yeah.
Well, there you are. And you weren't thin, but you were slim, and you had a lot of energy and muscle, and you just went everywhere, and people would go, "Oh God, Craig, just looking at you makes us tired." I guess, did your parents tell that to you as well when you were a kid?
No, I don't recall that. They told me other things which aren't repeatable. Not that one.
Was your father a church minister?
Grandfather.
Grandfather. Yeah.
Sorry. Great-grandfather.
Great-grandfather, yeah, because he was one of the originals, I think, one of the original Presbyterian ministers in Otago, Southland, from memory.
Yeah, moderator of the Presbyterian Church in Southland. That's correct.
Yeah. I actually, he was part of my PhD. Actually, I think I read some of his original papers. It's not such a small world.
I think you described his sermons as fire and brimstone from memory.
Yeah. Well, that was the pretty standard sermon. All right. Well, actually, we must talk about that because you've got a fascinating life, Craig. Come back to yesterday's announcement first of all before we go and talk about other matters. Were you surprised? Not surprised? What are the effects of the announcement yesterday? What do you see as the enduring interest of the Reserve Bank in the OCR?
Not a surprise to me. What we tend to focus on is the words around the press release. And so the two phrases that I picked out for your listeners. The first one is core inflation is too high. And what they mean by that is if you take out food and energy from the headline inflation numbers, the underlying inflation number remains stuck at around 6%, and the Reserve Bank's trying to get it back into its box of 1 to 3% headline inflation. So that's the ongoing concern for them. And secondly, they believe that they'll retain the 5.5% official cash rate for a period of constrained spending. Now, that isn't limited by any time frame. You've got some pressures building with the fall in the New Zealand US dollar that your listeners may be aware of. We're now below 60 cents, and falling exchange rates result in higher imported inflation. So those pressures remain. And we have some ambivalence around how strong employment growth is in the marketplace. And so is the economy still steaming along a little bit too high for Reserve Bank's liking? Your listeners might like to log on to a website called gdplive.net, which is a Meta University program which tracks live inflation, live GDP, and gives you an estimate of what the official cash rate should be at, given those two things, the strength of the economy and the persistent inflation pressures. And it has a much higher OCR than we have today. And it's just a useful benchmark for thinking about what could happen. Not saying that that's a forecast, but it has a very good track record of recording where the forecast was and where actual inflation has come to. So the suspicion is that we may still be in for some further rate rises as per the Westpac announcement in the last week or so. But even so, for people on mortgages, they will have already got notification, despite the flat official cash rate track, of higher mortgages anyway. And there are lots of people still to receive their letters with a reset number that's going to be much higher than what they're paying today. So this period of constrained spending is going to go on for quite some time.
I've just done that while I was talking to you. That's very good too. Thank you, Craig, for that. I'll repeat that to listeners at the end of the show, but it's just gdplive.net.
.net.
Yeah. And the thing that I've just done is the regional GDP, and that's interesting too, isn't it?
Yeah. And further down, it shows you the track of actual inflation outcomes versus, their forecast versus actual outcomes. So it's quite impressive on that. So well done for Meta University for getting that going. It's a splendid piece of work which requires inputs from all sorts of activity levels all around the economy, which you couldn't do 20 years ago. You can do today with the feeds you can get through the with World Wide Web. So it's a pretty impressive piece of work, and is increasingly admired around the world. So we're lucky to have that locally.
Okay. Now, the other thing too, just on before we go, we've just talked this morning to Federated Farmers Dairy section about the dropping commodity price for milk solids and milk powder, etc., and the likely effects of that. I mean, you're an economist. I mean, that's your training. You've done a lot of things in your life, but you've also been an economist. Your assessment as to how our economy pans out over the next 6 to 12 months, irrespective of who gets into power?
Well, it'll be a weaker economy, but perhaps not as weak as the Reserve Bank would like. You recall the governor asked us to cool our jets back in January, and there's patchy signs of activity levels falling. Certainly, a weaker dairy payout makes it much harder for farmers facing cost of living pressures, falling revenue streams, and concerns over our concentrated exports to China, where their economy is definitely slowing. So, there'll be lots of concerns around what that means for supporting our farming sector during these times, both by the banks that are lent to them, but also suppliers who provide goods and services to farmers. So it won't be an easy time.
All right. Well, I suppose in some ways, I don't know if that makes it easier or harder, but there are a lot of promises being made at the moment on the campaign trail by all the parties, Craig. They're going to have to meet some of those, presumably to keep their political credibility. They're not going to have the money there to do it, though, are they?
Yeah, well, one that I'd like to discuss just briefly, Michael, is the GST debate on fresh and frozen fruit and veggies. And I know that people are probably pretty much across the fact that most of the economics community are poo-pooing the concept, and rightly so. But just for the record, Dr. Michael Cullen's tax working group in February 2019 had a recommendation, number 87, do not remove GST from food and drink. That was very clearly laid out. And that's because GST exceptions are complex, they're poorly targeted for distributional goals, and they've got large compliance costs. But what caught my eye in the press release was the concept of convening an expert group before 1 April next year, when Labor wants to bring in this GST exclusion or exemption. And my thinking was, what would that expert group do? It would have to opine on, and you're a debating person, you know what the first person in the affirmative team has to do. They have to define the subject matter. So can you define for me what fresh means? Is fresh a day old, that a tuber that's been sitting in a warehouse in a farming shed in Dargo for 6 months and then is sold, is that still fresh? If it's not fresh or frozen but chilled, is that still eligible for GST exclusion? If a fruit includes a nut and the nut's put in a package, is the package, the bag, is that enclosure also subject to the exemption, or is it different? So you pay GST on the package but not on the nut. You can see what the expert group would quickly become. Would become the Ministry of Fruit and Vegetables, which would be an extraordinary group to be a member of. It's like an Italian absurd theatre, or Jonathan Swift and Gulliver's Travels. It's just pure theatre.
Right. I understand where you're coming from. So, given the fact that they ignored that, and you've headed yourself, you've chaired a number of tax advisory groups to the government in your time, Craig, is it been put, and given that Grant Robertson obviously, and I assume all of Treasury are saying pretty much the same thing that you were saying, but were overruled in a captain's call by the Prime Minister, the reality is that it's 7.5 months before this would take effect, even if Labor were re-elected anyhow.
Yes.
So, I mean, it's a true boondoggle, isn't it? Because it's not going to arrest the cost of living pressures at all, and they are here now.
Correct. Well, I think the other thing that's been quite rightly discussed is whether or not the full amount would pass through to consumers, or would vendors of fruit and vegetables take half of it for themselves. You know, you just don't know. So I suspect the numbers are pretty rubbery on what would pass through to consumers. I mean, the other bit in that whole release last week was that no one's discussing, which I think is an issue for all of us, is working for families. Was also mentioned with some changes to happen in 2026, again, a long way away. But one of the difficulties of talking about working for families is it's incredibly complex. It's designed to incentivise families to work with tax credits. So there are 350,000 families in New Zealand receiving tax credits, and the government's proposed to include another 160,000 families by 2026. But I looked at a 2010 report on how the scheme had gone from 2004, when it started under Dr. Michael Cullen, until 2008. And I just found the complexity leading to a whole lot of issues that I'd like to understand whether your callers also agree with, is that if I'm stuck in that system, and I'll call it a system, I'll call it stuck for a reason I'll be aware of in a moment, is that at the point where my income grows because I want to get a better job or I want to get a salary increase, and those tax credits fall away, which are given to you on the basis of how much you earn, number of dependents and other benefits. But there's a concept that you need to think about as an extra dollar of income, as you lose those tax credits, means your tax rate goes astronomically.
Yeah.
And so the estimate in the 2010 survey was that those people in some cases, would face marginal tax rate increases of 45%, in some cases 75%. So why would they want to increase their salary or move to a better job? I'd like to know from this audience that is listening to this conversation, I'd like to hear stories about, do you owe money to the IRD because you've been overpaid tax credits? Are you stuck in a regime where you cannot afford to go to a better job, in which case we've got a pool of labour that could be available to businesses for all sorts of good reasons, but they can't move? And I would like to know stories from the audience about this, because it's not talked about by the media, and it's announced last week, but it's a complex beast. And so to understand how to make change and move beyond this disincentive to work, let's hear the stories from people.
So let's go through this, Craig, because not everybody will be across it. If I am earning, or my household is earning under a certain amount of money, and I've got children, I can claim working for family. I think they're paid out fortnightly by the IRD.
Yes, IRD and the Ministry of Social Development are both involved, which makes it more complex for people trying to solve their own issues. But nevertheless, you're right. Keep going.
Yeah. So I'm still paying tax at the whatever the rate is to my employer, but I'm getting this money given to me every fortnight as a working for family credit, and comes directly banked into my bank account. And what you're saying is at the end of a financial year, and I've taken a bit of extra money, so I've got a bit of I've got a 5% raise or something from the boss, or alternative, I've got a new job, as you say. And what you're saying is at the end of the year, large numbers of people are finding that when their tax return is done, they owe the IRD money because they've been overpaid over that previous year from those working for families credits. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, because their income may fluctuate. Of course, some aren't working permanent hours.
Right, so sometimes, okay,
hours.
Yep. So my wife's working 20 hours and then suddenly she's working 30 at the season, or alternatively,
Correct.
I'm working a bit of overtime or
Correct.
something like that.
And so the estimate is something like $3 billion overall cost to taxpayers to make this scheme work at it makes work at about $8,200 per unit. So what are the challenges that our workers face with this regime? Is it true that they don't want to accept higher salaries or move into better jobs because of the increase in the marginal tax rates?
Yeah, and the disincentive. And people are pretty much onto that. Am I going to get more money for that? No, I'm not. All right, it's only not worth the effort and all that sort of stuff.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And it's a very...
Have you actually done any work, though, Craig? Well, I don't know. You're probably the wrong person to ask, but you've got this interest. You've raised it now. Do the statistics exist as to how many people at the end of a financial year owe the IRD money from that, just what situation you've described?
I'm not sure, is my answer. You recall that Ardern asked for a review of working for families a couple of years ago. That report was forthcoming last year. Minister Cipollone has delayed releasing it. There was supposed to be some mention in the budget around some increased benefits, but the review was still not forthcoming. My suspicion is that Treasury is very concerned about the design of the scheme, as per what I've just discussed, but the announcement from the Minister Cipollone in the last week, in conjunction with the GST press release, was to prospectively add another 160,000 families and a higher tax credit. So, I'd like to see the full report. I'd like to understand, what are the issues for us. If they're akin to the 2010 report, we've got people that would like to work, but the system prevents them quite rationally from doing that.
Yes, this government has a problem as in releasing official reports.
We have a problem. But businesses have a problem because there may be a pool of workers that can't work rationally, don't want to change jobs, don't want to work longer hours because of the tax credit system. And if that's true, we're creating another barrier to, growth of careers, of opportunities for people, for businesses to get workers. And it was silent. The media's been silent on that part of the press release, which is extraordinary.
Why do you put that down to? Do you put that down to a lack of educated journalists, too many young people coming straight out of some course somewhere with no background in economics? Or do you put it down to some sort of political bias? Is it incompetence or bias, do you think?
I'm just grabbing a couple of adjectives: laziness and courage to challenge the status quo.
Yes. Well, that might be a hangover, do you think, from when the media took a particular stance during COVID that all the public health official announcements shouldn't be questioned and should be championed as well, yeah? Absolutely. Good science always challenges the status quo. Yes.
You put up a hypothesis, you test it.
Yep.
You get a pass or a fail. You then move on to the next thing. Why aren't we testing hypotheses all the time? That's what good science does.
Well, we didn't during COVID, Craig, did we? Seriously. I mean, and those, professors that did, like I think Professor Des Gorman, for example, from the med school and others like that, they were quickly told, get back in your box.
I agree. I agree with that.
I wonder if some of that, mind you, listen, that's why the platform exists in other areas as well. The mainstream media aren't doing their job. Mind you, you live in Auckland now, don't you?
I do.
Just to share something with you on that, purchased a newspaper in Wellington, so what we used to know, Craig, as the Old Dominion, and it's now called The Post.
Yeah.
And I picked it up yesterday and I thought I'll buy the paper because I had obviously some hours to kill, plural, at the airport. It was 24 pages of tabloid and there were only 4 pages on what I'd call news and politics. And all the rest were lifestyle stuff and advertising and stuff like that. It was about the size of a community newspaper in a place like, Tikawiti. And that was it. And that was their daily newspaper for the day. So I don't know where people get their news from, but it's certainly not from printed publications anymore.
Yeah, and I think that Corolla, I don't know why you bought the pack in the first place, but there you go. But I think
$3.20 too, Craig. $3.20.
Well. Yeah, I'll take the GST off that. It might help. I think there's also an issue around going to primary sources, making sure that you just don't take the newspapers, but try and find the primary source, and that is a concern around how people accept news. So, behind an opinion or a news article, where is an information source from? And we've got to get better at doing that, regardless of the media. But I wouldn't be surprised if there are more concerns around, the revenue-generating abilities of what is mainstream media. The models are challenged by the way people get information and seek news, and it isn't necessarily through a newspaper.
No, that's true. Yeah, you're right. And finally, one other matter.
In fact, it's a good question to ask: should they be called newspapers?
Yes, they mostly appear to be opinion papers these days, don't they? No, fair enough. Oh, listen, we're getting old, aren't we? Well, no, we're not getting... Actually, somebody said that to me yesterday. He said, he was critical of something. He said, I'm getting old. No, no, don't say that. Because we need to keep on challenging. Otherwise, we'll just accept the current orthodoxy.
Well, the way I look at it is there's a chronological argument, which I kind of toss aside. The most important thing is your physiological age, Michael, and you must be 49. Sure.
I've got 3 teenage children. I'm 149.
Good stuff.
Good night, mate. Nice to talk to you again. Talk to you next week. You have a very good rest of the week. Thanks, mate. Ta. That is Craig Stobo, who actually is worth a book. No question. He's a fascinating life. Diplomat, economist, tax specialist, business person, mountain climber. He was just full of energy. He's just one of those kids. Went to Waitaki Boys High School in Oamaru. I think he was there when my father was principal of Waitaki, or rector as they called them down here in the south. They called at their boys' schools, you're the rector. It's a very unfortunate name, but there you are. It's Scottish. And he was at Waitaki Boys when my father was there. He was a bit younger than I was, Craig. How do I know Craig? Well, I'm glad that I do. But Craig and Rod Carr, who's the current Climate Change Commissioner, Dr. Rod Carr, former Vice-Chancellor of Canterbury University, and I think he was the Reserve Bank Governor there for a wee while, and I were all students at Otago University, and we were the Otago University #1 debating team. So I used to be number one. I'd be the #1 speaker. Craig was our number 2. He was the responsible for delivering the content. And Craig and Rod Carr was our number 3. He was brilliant at rebuttal. So he was brilliant at, on the fly, just basically destroying or disassembling an alternative argument or the argument of the opposition. So we were a debating team for, I think a number of years, and that's how we got to know each other. I think Craig ended up with a first-class honours in economics, and then Rod ended up with ditto, and then he went to Harvard and got a master's and then a PhD. And I think it was Harvard, one of the business schools in America. Craig went into the foreign affairs, so he became a diplomat initially. I think one of his postings, so I'm sure I met him later on, was in Washington, D.C. And what did I do? I became an unemployed layabout in Dunedin. Yeah, I know. Until my bank manager rang me up, true story, and said, Michael, we're not honouring any more of your cheques. And I said, that's a bit tough. He said, but you are seriously overdrawn. I said, well, what about we could, until next week or month or something? He said, no. Give you till Friday. And so by Friday I had a job. Bank managers, you see. No, but there you go. So they've gone on and done brilliant stuff in their life, and, then there's me. I say this story to my children all the time because I say, if you are going to go to university, and my oldest, not my oldest daughter, but my oldest teenage daughter, she's been accepted into Auckland and Otago, and I'm saying, for God's sake, don't go to Otago. But she wants to go there because all her friends are there. I'm saying, no, go to a decent university. There's only one in New Zealand, that's Auckland at the moment. But I say to her, go and join the debating club. I say to all my children, go and join the debating club at a university, because you will meet the business leaders, the political leaders, the commercial leaders, the opinion shapers of the future in your debating club. And that was certainly true. I think, I'm just trying to think, all of our prime ministers over the last 10, 20 years, John Key's the exception, and all of our finance ministers over the last 20 years have been members of the debating club. I think all the leaders of the Labour Party came out of debating clubs at various universities as well. Bill English was a big debater. Who else? John Bishop. Not the Bishop, his son. What's his son? What's the Bishop, leader of the National Party House? He was actually in New Zealand. So
Chris Bishop.
And Chris Bishop, that's right, yeah. Nicola Willis, the Deputy Leader of the National Party. They were all there. And I don't know why, but the debating clubs aren't very big. They're usually only about 30 or 40 will join them. And when you think of campuses of 25,000, that's not very big at all. But for some strange reason, bang, those debating clubs. And there wouldn't be, I was thinking back the other day, I was just trying to work out how many members of parliament came out of us, how many cabinet ministers, how many prime ministers. It's just huge.